You're listening to the Bear in Mind podcast, episode number 4.
A podcast about love, color, and identity, and where driving yourself crazy is totally sane and curable. Now your host, T. Vias.
Welcome to the podcast. Today is about what makes you interesting to others. And it's kind of a weird question, unless you ask somebody, well, what do you think makes me interesting? It's maybe kind of hard to actually know what other people think or what other people find interesting about you. And in the last episode, I discussed with you what you think makes you interesting. So I highly recommend that you check that episode out as well. And so for this episode, I'm going to talk about what makes you interesting to others and how you can tell. And sometimes the case is you may not be very interesting to others, and people may decide this based on their own opinions, their own ideas, their own belief systems. And so I'm going to discuss kind of what happens a little bit in social groups outside of your immediate group or your more intimate group, so your family or your roommates, but more in your everyday social groups. It could be a group of friends, it could be your coworkers, your book club. So I'm going to share with you some experiences I've had over time, and then share with you 2 recent examples that I had about what indicated what somebody found interesting about me. And my first experience when I kind of started to notice how people find other people interesting was I was in a social group where probably well-known acquaintances, that's the best way to describe it. And somebody who doesn't come to the group showed up, and she worked in the film industry. I can't remember exactly what her profession was, but she worked in the film industry. And the whole conversation between like the 4 or 5 of us revolved around her profession. And we continued to discuss what she did and events and things like that around the film industry. And I sort of noticed that it's like with some professions seem more interesting to other people. So the film industry was one, and I have another friend, and he's a doctor. And people will ask him a ton of questions about health, and the conversation will tend to lean towards his profession. So kind of one of the things that I noticed is people will find your profession interesting, especially if it's in contrast to their own. So then in many of my conversations, I started to notice that the questions or the statements that people say to me or to other people, it lends itself a little bit, it indicates a little bit of what other people find interesting in you. And I've also seen this happen when there's a gay person in the group. They'll often get questions that are centered around them being gay. Do they have straight friends? When did they realize they were gay? Have they ever slept with somebody who's the opposite sex? And so a lot of the questions will be focused around somebody's sexual orientation. And in my case, I'll share with you the conversations that are very common to me. So in some of my social groups, for example, if we're talking about fashion or clothing in general, I'll often get the question, do you still own or do you have or wear your traditional dresses, your traditional Indian dresses like the sari? Or if we're talking about jewelry, they'll ask me, well, what does the nose ring mean? What does the red dot on the forehead mean? And if we're talking about the weather, in particular going to the beach, they'll ask me, well, or they'll actually say to me, oh, you're so lucky, you don't have to worry about sunscreen and sunburn and all that kind of stuff. So they'll make statements centered around me being a person of color. And I recently had a conversation with somebody. We were in a cafe. It's a group of mine where I wouldn't say we're close friends, but we're well-known acquaintances. That's what I would say. And we were talking about cooking, and I have taught myself how to cook, and I love to cook. And we were talking about different dishes, and all of a sudden, one of the women, she said, "Do you cook curry?" And I answered, "No, I don't cook curry." And I just kind of had a chuckle at that question because I had been thinking about this episode of the podcast. And so after this conversation, I was reflecting on my own answer to it, which I just basically said, "No, I don't cook curry." And then I was also thinking about all of the past conversations that I've had. I mean, the recent past conversations, and thinking about, well, this kind of indicates to people what's interesting about you, kind of based on what they think is interesting. And then why is it these certain things people find interesting? So in the first example, when I talked about people's profession, the doctor, or being gay, or being a person of color, those are things that are circumstances in our lives, in the sense that being gay and being a person of color, those are circumstances in which we've had no choice. And our professions or any skill that we have are circumstances today because we, as a result of what we've achieved. So today they are circumstances by choice. And oftentimes people tend to ask questions about these circumstances in social conversations like these. So then I also flipped the question around and thought about, what do I ask other people about? What do I find interesting about other people when I learn a little bit about something? What do I choose to ask or follow up on? And one of the things that I noticed in myself was that I tend to remember the things that are unfamiliar to me. And so if somebody does have a profession that I don't know anything about, I tend to ask a little bit more about that profession. I tend to ask things about, like, for example, if there's a sport somebody plays that I've never played, I tend to ask questions about that sport. And we focus on the unfamiliar because it's what humans are kind of meant to do. Familiarity to us keeps us safe, and the unfamiliar tells us it's unsafe. So there's this negative link, and not necessarily negative in a bad way, but a negative way in a survival way, that if something is unfamiliar to us, it's not safe, and therefore requires our attention and our focus. And this primitive response, this primitive reaction, is what has helped us survive. So if something's unfamiliar to us, we pay attention to it to make sure that it's safe. And so a lot of times in day-to-day life, we go about and respond this way. Even in simple conversations, we tend to focus on what is unfamiliar to us. So if there's a person who is gay or a person of color in a group where the other people are straight and the other people are white, it is an alert to the brain that, hey, someone is unfamiliar to us. And so since this is such a primitive reaction, and if we're not consciously aware of it, most people will, who are not familiar with me or who are not people of color, will continue to ask me if I have a sari in my closet. And so then the next question becomes, what do you do in a situation where the focus and the attention in the conversation is centered around a circumstance, and especially in a circumstance that you don't really think is very interesting? And I'll have to say for myself, being Indian ethnicity isn't the most interesting thing about me. After all, there are a lot of people in this world with Indian ethnicity. And so when I looked into what I actually thought I found interesting about myself, I actually found it wasn't a bunch of circumstances like my ethnicity, like the fact that I'm a woman. I found that the journey that and the experiences, but the journey that had led me to some of the circumstances in my life, I found those to be the most interesting things about myself. And so coincidentally, I had another conversation with a friend of mine, and she is a person of color, and she asked me the question, well, do you crave any Indian dishes? And so I kind of smiled, but I paused. And what I said in response was not just, no, I don't crave Indian dishes. I responded with my journey, and in this case, my truth. So what I said to her, what I responded to her was, I don't really crave any food anymore since I've discovered that I used to eat some foods for pleasure, and now I don't utilize food for pleasure. I utilize it to just nourish my body. And from there, the conversation steered into discussions about using food to fulfill pleasure, emotional eating, and the discussion went in a more interesting direction. And I thought that that was interesting because I had realized what I found interesting about myself, which is a circumstance that's interesting about me is that I taught myself how to cook. But the journey in which I am on with learning how to cook and the journey with food is what I think is the most interesting thing about me. And I responded with a little bit of the story of my journey with food to her question instead of just, no, I don't crave any Indian dishes. So people will continue to focus on the unfamiliar and maybe find your race or your gender the most interesting about you. And I think the way to maybe make that conversation more interesting is to determine what you think is the most interesting thing about you. Respond with that. So I'm going to wrap it up here, and I highly recommend that you check out the episode before this one. It's an exercise on how to find out the most interesting thing about yourself, and I'll check back with you next week.
Thanks for listening. Listen for a new episode next Tuesday by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform. Bye for now.